When you go silent, something fascinating happens, something most people don't understand until they step back and finally see it from the outside. Silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the absence of certainty. And certainty is what so many people rely on without realizing it. When a man knows you will always text back, always initiate, always check in, always smooth over the tension, he builds an internal world where your presence is assumed. Not appreciated, assumed, and the moment someone assumes you, they stop seeing the value of the role you play in their emotional life. This is why silence is so powerful, not because it's a strategy, not because it's a punishment, but because it interrupts the illusion of availability. It stops the automatic belief that you're always there no matter how little he shows up. People think silence is about withholding. It's not. It's about allowing the reality to speak for you. Your absence says what your presence was too gentle to reveal. You were the one keeping the connection alive. Imagine a man who gets used to you filling every gap. You ask the thoughtful questions, you make the plans, you keep the emotional temperature warm and stable. He doesn't consciously think, she'll always be here. But subconsciously, he builds that pattern. And once a pattern exists, it becomes invisible. Humans don't pay attention to what's predictable. We pay attention to what we fear losing or what we don't fully understand. Silence creates both. The moment you step back and stop communicating on autopilot, he suddenly feels a shift he didn't expect. It might start subtly. He notices his phone didn't light up with your message this morning. He checks something online and realizes he hasn't heard from you in a day. And for the first time in a long time, he's confronted with a question he hasn't had to ask himself. Did something change? That question alone breaks the illusion. Silence forces him to take notice of a reality he didn't have to acknowledge before, that you are not a guarantee, you are a choice. A person with free will, someone who doesn't need to fill space just to feel connected. Someone who values herself enough to allow the silence to speak in her place. And here's the deeper truth. Silence doesn't create value. It reveals value. Your presence was meaningful long before you stepped back, but he couldn't see it because he never had to imagine life without it. When you stop being the one who bridges the gap, he sees the gap for the first time. And the gap isn't empty. It's shaped exactly like your effort, your warmth, your consistency. This is what silence does. It removes the noise long enough for him to hear his own feelings. It removes your availability long enough for him to feel his own desire. It removes the illusion long enough for him to understand the difference between comfort and appreciation. And for you, silence becomes a moment of clarity too. It frees you from overgiving and over-explaining. It pulls you out of the cycle of trying to earn what should be naturally reciprocated. So if you ever feel uncertain about stepping back, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Silence isn't what makes him realize your worth. Your worth was there all along. Silence just removes the distractions so he can finally see it. When you go silent, you don't just create space. You expose emotional responsibility. And this is where a lot of people get uncomfortable because deep down they know they've been carrying the entire emotional weight of the connection. They've been the one reaching out, the one maintaining the rhythm, the one keeping things alive. But once you step back, something crucial becomes visible, the balance of effort, or in many cases, the imbalance. When you stop initiating, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop cushioning his inconsistent behavior with your consistent kindness, he suddenly has to confront a version of the relationship without your emotional leadership. It forces him into a position where his next move actually matters, because now the dynamic he relied on, the one where you unconsciously did the work of two people, is interrupted, And when a pattern breaks, it reveals what the pattern has been hiding. This is why so many men suddenly become alert the moment a woman goes quiet. It's not because he's afraid of losing you immediately. It's because he becomes aware, often for the first time, of the invisible contributions you were making. The way you remembered details about his day, the way you made him feel understood, the way your messages added an emotional texture to his life that he mistook for normal. Silence puts those things into sharp contrast. You see, effort is one of the clearest mirrors in relationships. When you pause yours, his reflection appears. You finally get to see how much he's willing to invest when there's no emotional safety net underneath him. And he gets to see, often uncomfortably, how passive he's been. That's the discomfort silence creates, not punishment, not manipulation, but accountability. It gives him a moment where he can choose, not drift, not assume choose. Some men rise to that moment. They step forward, they text first, they ask if you're okay, they show real curiosity about what's going on with you. They put energy into rebuilding the connection because suddenly they understand they contributed far less than they thought. And those efforts are important, not because they fix everything instantly, but because they show awareness, they show capability, they show a willingness to meet you halfway. But silence also reveals the opposite. If he does nothing, no reach out, no attempt to reconnect, no shift in behavior, that's information too. Painful, yes, but valuable, because your silence didn't push him away. It just removed your effort long enough to show that he had none of his own. And that's the beauty of stepping back. You don't lose anything. You gain clarity. You no longer evaluate his feelings based on what he says in passing or what he promises in theory. You evaluate them based on what he does when the responsibility to act is finally his. Silence becomes a diagnostic tool. It helps you see whether the connection had two participants or one enthusiast and one passenger. So when you step back, don't fear the space you're creating. It isn't emptiness, it's truth. It shows you exactly who he is when your effort is no longer holding everything together. And the truth, even when it stings, is always a gift, because it frees you to choose better. Sometimes the most powerful shift doesn't happen when you walk away, it happens when you stop explaining yourself. There comes a moment when you realize that repeating your needs, restating your boundaries, or reminding someone how to treat you isn't clarity anymore. It's caretaking. And when you fall silent, you remove that caretaking. You stop protecting him from the consequences of not listening the first time. That silence forces him into a position he's not used to, one where he has to reflect instead of react. People rarely change when they're comfortable. They change when their comfort is interrupted, and your silence interrupts a pattern he's been benefiting from. It takes away the emotional instructions he's grown dependent on, the reassurance, the reminders, the attempts to keep the connection warm. Suddenly, he's faced with the echo of his own behavior, the things he overlooked, the moments he dismissed, the effort he assumed he didn't have to make. When you stop feeding a dynamic, you expose whether he ever intended to contribute to it in the first place. This is where a lot of people misunderstand silence. They think it's about withdrawal or punishment, but the truth is much deeper. Silence gives you back your energy. It stops leaking into someone who wasn't valuing it. And it gives him the necessary room to realize that emotional connection doesn't maintain itself. Someone has to show up for it. If he genuinely cares, this is the moment he becomes aware of your absence not as a threat, but as a wake-up call. He starts noticing that conversations don't initiate themselves, that emotional intimacy doesn't just magically happen, that your presence wasn't just convenient, it was meaningful. Silence isn't loud, but it is precise. It shows him the difference between what he assumed you would always provide and what life actually feels like without it. But here's the deeper psychology. Silence reveals whether a man is connected to you or simply used to you. If he was connected, he will feel the shift internally and respond with intentionality. He may reach out with sincerity instead of routine. He may ask deeper questions instead of surface-level check-ins. He moves not because he fears losing the idea of you, but because he realizes the real you, your effort, your warmth, your support has been missing, and he wants it back. If he was merely accustomed to your presence, however, your silence won't awaken him. It will expose him. He may disappear because he was never emotionally invested. He was just enjoying the convenience of your effort. And that's not a loss. That's clarity you would have eventually needed anyway. What this moment ultimately teaches you is that silence is not passive. It's intentional. It's an act of self-respect that rebalances the emotional equation without anger, drama, or pressure. It pulls focus away from convincing him and back to restoring you. And once you understand that, you stop seeing silence as a tactic and start seeing it as wisdom. Because when you stop explaining what you need, you finally get to see who is willing to meet those needs without being told. And that truth, clear, simple, and undeniable, is the truth that sets you free. There's a moment in every relationship, or almost relationship, when silence stops being a reaction and becomes a mirror. And that mirror doesn't just reflect him, it reflects you. Up until now, you may have been measuring your worth by how much you were giving, how much effort you were investing, or how much emotional heavy lifting you were doing. But when you step back and go silent, something interesting happens. You finally get to see the relationship without your contribution propping it up. And that clarity is incredibly powerful. Silence isn't just about what he feels. It's about what you discover about yourself. You start to realize how much emotional noise was filling your life, the overthinking, the explanations, the rationalizing of behavior that didn't deserve to be rationalized. When that noise falls away, you meet a quieter version of yourself, one that's wiser and far more intuitive. You begin to understand that love isn't supposed to feel like a constant performance. It's not supposed to require you to audition for appreciation. Most people assume silence is a strategy to get someone back. But in truth, silence is a return to yourself. It's the moment you stop reaching outward for validation and start reconnecting inward with your own standards, your own desires, your own emotional equilibrium. And that reconnection is where authentic confidence grows. Confidence doesn't come from getting the person you wanted. It comes from realizing you don't lose yourself trying. When you remove your voice from the dynamic, you also remove your excuses. You're no longer justifying bad behavior because you're no longer engaging in it. You're no longer explaining why he deserves more time, more patience, more chances. Silence is the moment you get honest, not about him, but about the version of yourself you want to be. A version who doesn't beg for clarity, a version who doesn't negotiate her self-worth, a version who isn't afraid to lose someone who isn't showing up. What's equally powerful is that silence teaches you to observe instead of interpret. You start paying attention to actions instead of imagined potential. You start noticing patterns instead of promises. You stop hoping he'll suddenly become who you needed and start seeing who he actually is when you're not carrying the relationship on your back. And in many cases, that clarity hurts, but it also liberates, because once you see reality without emotional filters, you can finally choose from a place of truth rather than attachment. That's where your strength emerges, not from being unaffected, but from being aware. This is the shift most people never reach because they're too afraid of the quiet. But the quiet is where you grow. It's where emotional independence starts taking shape. It's where self-worth becomes non-negotiable. And it's where you finally understand that silence isn't the absence of communication. It's the presence of boundaries. When you step into that level of inner clarity, your world changes. The people who are supposed to be in your life rise to meet you. The ones who aren't quietly fade, and you stop chasing connections that dilute who you are. So let the silence do its work, not to change him, but to reveal you. There's a fascinating shift that happens when your silence forces someone to confront the reality you used to protect them from. Because before, you were the emotional buffer, you softened the discomfort, you filled the awkward spaces, you carried the responsibility of keeping the connection alive, and when you stop doing that, something very human happens on his end. He becomes aware of the void you used to fill. Not because you're punishing him, not because you're playing games, but because human beings are wired to notice the absence of what they took for granted more sharply than the presence of what they always had. That's psychology. The mind wakes up in contrast, and your silence asterisk is asterisk that contrast. This is the point where he starts replaying everything he overlooked, the messages he skimmed, the moments he didn't appreciate, the small acts of care you offered so effortlessly. When you go quiet, he finally has the space to feel the loss that your presence had been preventing. It's almost ironic. When you were giving, he didn't process the value behind it. But when you remove yourself, he suddenly sees how much you were giving. And that's the emotional awakening silence brings. It forces him to sit with his own choices. It strips away the comforting illusion that you'll always be there no matter how little he invests. He begins to notice the difference between a woman who tries and a woman who finally stops trying. Those two versions of you feel very different to him, and he learns quickly which one he actually misses. This isn't about turning your silence into punishment. It's about letting reality speak louder than your effort, because here's the truth most people forget. Effort can hide imbalance. Your energy can hide his lack of it. Your consistency can hide his hesitation. Your presence can hide his emotional absence. But your silence reveals it all. It reveals whether his interest had depth or just convenience. It reveals whether he was committed or simply entertained. It reveals whether he ever cared enough to step forward without you pulling him, and if he does step forward not out of fear, but out of recognition. That tells you something powerful. It tells you your worth was never the issue. His readiness was, his maturity was, his willingness to meet you was. Silence gives him the opportunity to realign, but it also gives you the opportunity to watch without attachment. And this is the real gift of the whole experience. You learn to trust what people do when you stop over-functioning. You learn to respect your own boundaries. You learn that love is not sustained by constant effort from one side, but by mutual investment. If he rises to the moment, you'll see it clearly. If he doesn't, you'll see that even more clearly. Silence doesn't confuse the truth, it clarifies it. So let the silence reveal what words could never convince. Let it show you who he is without your effort, and let it show him who you become when you finally recognize your worth. There's a moment, and every strong woman knows this moment, when silence stops being about him and becomes entirely about you. Up until now, the silence has been a mirror reflecting his behavior back to him. It's shown him what he lost, what he ignored, what he didn't protect. But eventually, that mirror shifts direction. It stops pointing outward and turns inward. And that's where the real transformation happens. Because silence isn't just absence, it's recalibration. It's you stepping out of the noise of someone else's inconsistency and re-entering the rhythm of your own life. When you stop reaching out, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop rescuing the connection over and over again, something profound occurs. Your energy returns to you. Think about it. When you were constantly investing, your emotional system was working overtime. You were alert, responsive, attuned to his every shift. You were interpreting texts, analyzing tone, waiting for signals that never came on time. And that kind of emotional labor drains you without you even realizing it. But when you go quiet, the tension dissipates. The energy you were sending outward begins to circulate inward. You start to hear yourself again, your intuition, your boundaries, your desires, your standards. You recognize what felt off for so long, not because you're angry, but because you're finally clear. Silence has a way of cleaning the emotional clutter you didn't notice until it disappeared. And once that internal clarity returns, something interesting happens in the dynamic between you and him. Your silence no longer feels like a reaction to his behavior. It becomes a reflection of your self-respect. You're no longer waiting for him to realize your worth. You're living in it, and whether he wakes up or not becomes less important. Not because you don't care, but because you've remembered that your life doesn't pause for someone else's uncertainty. This shift from waiting to choosing, from reacting to leading, creates a completely different gravitational pull. It changes the energy in the space between you. If he has depth, he will feel it. If he has maturity, he will respond to it. If he has emotional intelligence, he will step toward you with intention instead of excuses. But if he doesn't, then your silence becomes the boundary that protects your future from a man who wasn't built to walk into it. You see, silence isn't just absence. It's a doorway back to your power, your clarity, your voice, your standards. It's the moment you shift from trying to be chosen to choosing yourself. And once a woman reconnects with that version of herself, she becomes discerning. She becomes steady. She becomes grounded. And grounded women don't chase confusion, they attract certainty. So let the silence work for you, not against you. Let it refine your inner world. Let it clear the noise so you can hear your own strength again. Because in the end, silence doesn't just reveal his truth, it restores yours.